Picture the birth of the United States. It's July 4th, 1776. Inside Independence Hall, every colonial delegate stands shoulder to shoulder in perfect agreement. Thomas Jefferson presents the Declaration of Independence, and John Hancock signs his name so enormously that King George can read it without his spectacles. Outside, the Liberty Bell rings. Betsy Ross unfurls the first American flag, its 13 stars arranged in a perfect circle. George Washington watches approvingly, from horseback, smiling through a mouthful of wooden teeth, while standing near the cherry tree he absolutely did not chop down. It is a magnificent scene. It's also almost entirely bullshit. Not because the founding of the United States was insignificant, and not because the symbols are meaningless or its ideals are worthless. The real story simply doesn't require a stage to be set. The actual founding was uncertain. It was divided, it was international, contradictory, and held together with printing presses, foreign loans, political bargaining, military desperation, and a truly heroic quantity of paperwork. The people involved were not marble statues waiting to be installed in government buildings. They were frightened, ambitious, argumentative human beings attempting to build a country while fighting a war they were not guaranteed to win. So today we're going into the National Attic to examine 6 stories Americans have repeated so often that they've become almost inseparable from the founding itself. Some began as family legends, while some were created by writers. Some came from the paintings, the pageants, the textbooks, and the civic celebrations we've had since then. But most took complicated history and gave it a cleaner haircut. So welcome to the 250th anniversary Naked History Debrief. Let's get into it, shall we? Welcome back to Naked History Debrief, the companion commentary and the extended footnote to our American 250th special. The American Experiment is Haunted. Now, across the special, we've looked at the United States as an unfinished argument, a country built from enormous promises, glaring contradictions, reoccurring reinventions, and a frankly unreasonable quantity of fireworks. And this episode is about the stories that gathered around the country's birth. Now, myth, when we say myth here, does not always mean a deliberate lie. Sometimes a myth begins with a real person or event, with each retelling making it smoother. The uncomfortable details disappear, and the dialogue is invented of sorts. Political disagreements become solemn unity, and ordinary objects become sacred relics that apparently understood their historical importance while history was still happening. Most people living through the revolution did not know which moments would eventually appear on the lunchboxes, and they didn't know that July 4th would become the national holiday. They didn't call the State House bell the Liberty Bell, and they didn't know which early flag design Americans would eventually treat as the first official version. National myths are usually created backwards. We begin with the country that survived and rearrange its birth so that the survival appears inevitable. And it wasn't. It certainly doesn't make the founding less remarkable anyway. It makes it more than remarkable. Now, the famous painting of the American founding shows the Declaration of Independence being presented to the Continental Congress. Nearly every major figure is there. Everyone is dressed beautifully, and nobody appears sweaty or exhausted or irritated, or quietly calculating how long the meeting will continue. Now, from that image and countless reenactments, many Americans absorb the same basic story. Congress declared independence and signed the Declaration on July 4th, 1776. And as we had seen in the special, that's not exactly what happened. Congress voted for independence on July 2nd. That was the divisive political act. 12 colonial delegates supported Richard Henry Lee's resolution declaring that the colonies were free and independent states. New York initially abstained because its delegates had not yet received authorization to vote in favor of independence. Now, John Adams believed July 2nd would become the great national anniversary. He imagined future generations celebrating it with ceremonies, bonfires, bells, and illuminations. He predicted the entire 4th of July tradition with astonishing accuracy and then placed it on the wrong day. Now, Congress spent the next 2 days revising the Declaration's language, and on July 4th, it approved the final text and sent it to printer John Dunlap. Those printed copies carried the names of John Hancock, the President of Congress at the time, and Secretary Charles Thomson. It did not carry the familiar collection of handwritten signatures now displayed at the National Archives. Congress didn't order the Declaration to be copied onto parchment until July 19th, and so most delegates signed that version on August 2nd, and others added their names later. The Declaration was therefore not signed during one electrifying afternoon. It was voted upon, revised, adopted, printed, engrossed, and signed across several weeks. That sounds less like a climax of a historical drama and more like somebody attempting to close on a house. And there's mythology surrounding John Hancock here as well. According to legend, Hancock wrote his name so large that King George III could read it without his spectacles. Now, there's no contemporary evidence that he said that, and Congress also had no intention of mailing the signed parchment to the king like the world's most aggressive resignation letter. Hancock was president of Congress at the time and signed prominently in the space associated with his office. He already possessed a large, confident signature, and the other delegates later signed beneath him in columns. So the invented line is a little unnecessary. Hancock publicly attached his name to rebellion against one of the world's most powerful empires. The actual act carried enough risk without a screenwriter adding the dialogue. Now, July 4th still matters. It's the date Congress adopted the final declaration and the date printed at the top of the document. But American independence didn't arrive in one perfect moment. It emerged through votes and revisions and printing presses and delayed instructions, political maneuvering, and months of signatures. The United States was not born with a thunderclap, it arrived through committee work. Now, the phrase founders makes the revolutionary generation sound like a single creature with powdered hair and one carefully organized set of opinions. But we discussed what the founders believed, what they wanted or intended, as though they met every Thursday, agreed upon the nation's purpose, and maintained a shared Google document. They didn't. And not to mention, they weren't even one single generation. In the summer of 1776, Benjamin Franklin was 70 years old, making him the elder statesman in every possible sense. George Washington was 44, John Adams was 40, while Thomas Jefferson, the man drafting some of the most consequential words in American history, was only 33. Then came the men whose most famous work still lay ahead of them. James Madison was 25 and not yet become the architect of the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton was either 19 or 21, depending on which disputed birth year you accept. He was serving as a young artillery officer, not yet designing the nation's financial system or preparing to become the subject of musical theater. The people who we now bundle together as the founders are therefore separated by decades of age and experience. Some were established political leaders, and others were young lawyers or soldiers or provincial politicians who would not perform their most famous work until years after the independence. They didn't gather in one room in 1776, and they certainly did not arrive with one shared vision of the country. They disagreed about almost everything you could disagree about for the starting of the country, about independence, military strategy, diplomacy, taxation, slavery, religion, Western expansion, executive power, representation, and what kind of nation they were attempting to create. And they disagreed loudly and personally, and with the 18th century equivalent of typing 14 consecutive paragraphs because someone on the internet was slightly wrong. Even independence faced serious resistance. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania opposed declaring independence when Congress considered it. He believed that reconciliation might still be possible and feared that an immediate declaration would impose the colonies to military disaster without sufficient foreign support. Now, others had already concluded that reconciliation was impossible, but some remained uncertain, but eventually accepted independence because the war had changed their calculations. The supposed unanimity of July 1776 was carefully constructed. Unity was the destination, it was not the starting condition. The population outside Congress was even more divided. Patriots supported resistance for different reasons, and loyalists remained attached to the crown. Many people attempted to remain neutral to protect their families or preserve their businesses or just avoid having armed men from either side confiscate their food. In some regions, particularly the South, the revolution resembled a civil war. Communities fractured and neighbors informed on neighbors. Families chose opposing alliances. At Kings Mountain in 1780, the Patriot Force fought an army made up of overwhelmingly American loyalists under British command. It wasn't simply America against Britain, it was also Americans fighting other Americans over what America would become. Now, thousands of loyalists eventually left the United States. They resettled in Canada, Britain, the Caribbean, and elsewhere among the empire. Among them were black loyalists who had escaped slavery and entered British lines after receiving promises of freedom. And their stories complicate any tidy image of the revolution as a single people rising together. The rebellion succeeded because enough people formed a coalition and kept it from collapsing. That coalition was unstable, argumentative, and constantly threatened by regional interests. The disagreement, however, makes the achievement more impressive. Unity manufactured by a painting is not particularly meaningful. Unity created through negotiation, compromise, and persuasion is definitely more impressive. Now, Betsy Ross occupies a special place in American mythology. According to the familiar story, George Washington visited her Philadelphia upholstery shop along with Robert Morris and George Ross. They presented a design for a new national flag with six pointed stars. Betsy had suggested five pointed stars, demonstrated on how to create one with a single cut, and sewed the first stars and stripes. And this story contains nearly everything a national legend needs. It has Washington, it has a secret meeting, and it has domestic ingenuity. It has a practical woman quietly correcting several powerful men through superior arts and crafts technique. The problem is that no contemporary evidence confirms it. The story didn't become public until 1870 when Betsy Ross's grandson, William Canby, presented the family tradition to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. That was nearly a century after the supposed meeting. And historians have searched government records, letters, diaries, and congressional documents without finding proof that Washington ever commissioned Ross to create the first flag or that she designed it. Now, that doesn't mean that Betsy Ross was invented. She was a real Philadelphia upholsterer and businesswoman, and she produced materials for the revolutionary cause and is documented for having made flags later in the war. Women like Ross performed essential labor while only receiving a fraction of the public recognition granted to generals and politicians. But Betsy Ross was a flag maker, and Betsy Ross designed and sewed the first American flag are not the same claim. The second rests upon family tradition, rather than surviving contemporary evidence. Now, Congress's first original flag resolution creates another problem for the legend. Adopted officially on June 14, 1777, it required 13 alternating red and white stripes and 13 white stars on a blue field, representing a new constellation. And that was essentially the entire design brief. Congress didn't specify the proportions of the flag, or the arrangement of the stars, or the number of points each star should have, or the precise shade of red and blue. There was no official attachment labeled final flag.jpg do not edit. Now, the early American flags consequently varied. Stars appeared in rows, circles, arcs, and other patterns, and they could possess 5, 6, or 7, or even 8 points. The familiar circle of 13 stars became iconic because it was so visually striking and symbolically satisfying. No state appears above the other, and the stars form an unbroken ring. But Congress didn't require that arrangement. Even the popular meanings attached to the colors arrived later. Red for valor, white for purity, and blue for allegiance and justice were explanations associated with the Great Seal adopted in 1782. The flag resolution of 1777 did not assign those meanings. Now, that doesn't make the symbolism worthless. Symbols, as we've talked about countless times on this podcast, gather meaning over time. But the first national flag was not one perfectly controlled design delivered by one identifiable creator. It was an evolving family of designs produced by different people attempting to interpret a remarkably vague congressional resolution. It was America's first branding package, essentially red, white, blue, 13 of everything, and use your best judgment. Now, our next myth covers the Liberty Bell, as it may be the most recognizable physical symbol of the American founding. It is large, cracked, and positioned near Independence Hall like Philadelphia's most famous retired employee. According to the legend, the bell rang on July 4th, 1776, announcing independence to the city. Unfortunately, there is no evidence that it did. There's also no solid evidence that it rang on July 8th when the Declaration was publicly read in Philadelphia. Now, other bells probably sounded during the celebrations, but the specific participation of the bell, now known as the Liberty Bell, cannot be confirmed. At the time, it was known more plainly as the State House Bell. It had been commissioned by the Pennsylvania Assembly and used for legislative meetings or public announcements and civic occasions. It did not yet possess the name that would make it famous. That transformation came during the 19th century. Abolitionists were drawn to the biblical inscription cast on the bell: proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. And in a country where millions remained enslaved, those words were less of a celebration than they were an accusation. Anti slavery activists adopted the bell as a symbol and helped popularize the name the Liberty Bell. It became connected to the struggle over whether the United States would apply its language of freedom to the people that it had excluded. And then in 1847, writer George Lepard published a fictional story about an elderly bell ringer waiting for news of independence. The bell rings dramatically after the Declaration is approved, announcing liberty to the people of Philadelphia. Now, the scene was fiction, but it is a vivid fiction. It entered popular memory and gradually began masquerading as documentation, but the real history is a little bit better. The bell matters not because it performed a perfectly timed sound effect in July of 1776. It matters because later Americans transformed it into a symbol and used its inscription to confront the country with its own contradictions. They looked at the promise of liberty, looked at the reality around them, and noticed the gap. The bell's crack may therefore be its most honest feature. It is a symbol of liberty that became famous because liberty remained incomplete. Now, turning from the Liberty Bell to arguably the founding father, George Washington attracts mythology like the way a wool coat attracts lint. The most famous of the story concerns a particular cherry tree. Young George received a hatchet, damages his father's prized tree, and then confesses because he cannot tell a lie. His father forgives him, declaring that George's honesty is worth more than 1,000 trees. Now, just like almost everything we've talked about in this episode, there's no evidence that this happened. The story was popularized by Mason Locke Weems, an author and traveling book salesman who published an enormously successful biography of Washington after the president's death. The cherry tree episode did not even appear in the earliest editions of the biography. Weems added it later, apparently deciding that Washington's life required additional childhood character development. The purpose was not to document Washington's youth, it was to create a national saint. The young United States needed heroes who embodied the Republican virtue of the fledgling nation. Washington was famous, respected, safely dead, and therefore unable to object when biographers began improving his childhood. Now, the story taught to children that the father of the country had been incapable of dishonesty from the moment he could hold a hatchet. It also created an interesting moral that destroying property is forgivable, provided you deliver a sufficiently memorable confession. And then there are the teeth of Washington. Washington wore dentures, but they were not made of wood. His dental appliances used a combination of lead, metal, animal ivory, animal teeth, and human teeth. Now, proportions may have become stained over time, producing the brownish appearance that helped the wood teeth legend survive, but the real dentures were very painful. They were heavy and uncomfortable, and they affected the shape of Washington's face and contributed to the tightly closed expression visible in some of his portraits. And the truth is considerably more unsettling than the myth. Wooden teeth sound rustic and almost wholesome, as though Washington spent a quiet afternoon on the porch carving himself a replacement molar. Now, the actual devices belong to a world of 18th century dentistry in which every available material was apparently considered acceptable except comfort. You can actually see those teeth at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. Highly recommend because they look horrific. Now, correcting these stories does not diminish Washington's importance. It does allow him, however, to become a human being again. Washington experienced chronic physical pain. He made mistakes. He could display extraordinary political restraint while remaining deeply entangled in the injustices of his society. And he helped establish republican precedents when enslaving other human beings. That person is more difficult than the saint produced by Weems, but he is also more historically useful. The founding generation became less meaningful when we pretend its members were both virtuous, fully formed, and permanently prepared for portraiture. Human beings made the country. That means their achievements were choices, not miracles. That also means their failures were choices. And lastly, up, the popular Revolutionary War narrative is wonderfully self contained. Farmers pulling muskets from above the fireplace, Minutemen pour in from the countryside, and George Washington holds the army together through sheer force of character. The scrappy Americans defeat the British Empire using grit, local knowledge, and an almost supernatural objection to taxation. Now, militia forces were important during the Revolutionary War. They gathered intelligence, defended communities, and disrupted British operations, and they also did fight in major engagements. But militia enthusiasm alone did not win the independence. The Continental Army supplied the sustained military force necessary to keep the rebellion alive. Its soldiers endured years of enlistment and shortages, disease, delayed pay, brutal marches, and repeated defeats. Washington's greatest military accomplishment may not have been a single brilliant victory. It was just keeping an army in existence for long enough for victory to remain possible. And even that wasn't enough. The war expanded into an international conflict. France provided money, weapons, supplies, soldiers, officers, and a supreme naval power to rival Britain. After the American victory at Saratoga, France formally allied with the United States in 1778. And that alliance forced Britain to divide its attention across the Atlantic, the Caribbean, Europe, India, and other parts of the empire. At Yorktown in 1781, thousands of French troops fought alongside Washington's army. French artillery helped pound British positions, and the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse controlled the Chesapeake and prevented Cornwallis from receiving reinforcements or escaping by sea. And without the French army and navy, there is no Yorktown as Americans remember it. And Spain also fought Britain. Although it did not form a direct alliance with the United States, Spanish campaigns along the Gulf Coast and Mississippi River forced Britain to defend additional territory. Spanish controlled Havana also became an important source of funds for the Yorktown campaign. Additionally, the Netherlands entered the wider conflict as well, adding further pressure to Britain's global war. And American independence was won by the Americans, but it wasn't won by Americans alone. And acknowledging that doesn't diminish the revolution. Alliances are not cheating. Diplomacy is a part of warfare. Convincing another country to risk money, ships, troops, and international conflict for your cause is a strategic achievement. The myth of complete self-reliance persists because it fits the way Americans often to prefer to imagine the nation. Independent, self-created, and beholden to no one. However, the historical United States entered the war very differently. It depended on foreign credit, imported weapons, international commerce, military partnerships, and several European powers agreeing that Britain deserved a deeply inconvenient decade. The American experiment began as part of the world, and it has never existed outside of it. And covering each of these myths doesn't make it any less incredible. Each takes a complicated process and transforms it into an image, but that doesn't mean we need to throw those images away. It just means we should understand how they were made. The symbol doesn't become worthless when its legend is corrected. The flag still carries meaning even if Betsy Ross didn't design it. The Liberty Bell remains powerful even if it didn't ring on July 4th. George Washington remains historically significant without the cherry tree, and the Revolution remains extraordinary even after France receives its overdue share of the closing credits. The real founding was not smaller than the mythology, it was larger. This country has spent 250 years deciding who is included within its promises, who possesses the authority to interpret them, and whether the words of the founding describe a complete achievement or an obligation inherited by every generation. The founders did not settle that argument, they just handed it to us. Perhaps that's why the founding remains haunted. We walk among symbols created by people who could not control what those symbols would eventually mean. We repeat stories developed by later generations trying to explain where the country came from and what it was supposed to become. Now, sometimes those stories comfort us. Sometimes they conceal things, and sometimes they remind us that the United States has never been one finished idea. It's been a debate conducted across centuries by people who inherited the language of liberty and immediately began arguing about whether the nation meant it. So, after 250 years, the honest answer may be that America is neither the flawless republic of its mythology nor the empty fraud of its harshest critics. It's a promise made by imperfect people, expanded by people they excluded, violated repeatedly, and defended stubbornly, and are still awaiting fulfillment. And that story is messier than the painting, and it's also worth telling. So that brings us to the end of the 250th special and this visit to the National Attic. Now, over the course of this series, we've examined the American experiment without the protective glass. We've looked at the ideals, the contradictions, the victories, the failures, and how the stories turned a chaotic revolution into a polished national origin. If you've enjoyed the special, follow us wherever you listen so you don't miss what's coming next. Ratings and reviews remain one of the simplest ways to help a new listener discover the show, especially people searching for history that is accurate without behaving as though fun is a violation of professional standards. You can also share this episode with someone who still believes George Washington installed hardwood flooring directly into his mouth. And let me know which piece of American folklore you learned as fact. Was it the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, or Pocahontas and John Smith? Maybe it was Benjamin Franklin wanting a turkey as the national bird. There are enough national legends left in the attic to keep us busy for several additional republics. Until next time, as always, I've been Dyllan, and this has been Naked History. And always remember, aside from stay curious, stay safe, and stay naked, just remember that history does not become less meaningful when we remove the mythology. It just finally becomes human. So with that in mind, take care until the next episode. We'll be digging into something a little fun. But until then, gotta keep you on edge. Have a good one, and we'll see you next time.